When most people think of serial killers, they picture the household names Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. But lurking in the shadows of criminal history are killers whose names you've likely never heard, despite body counts that rival or even surpass the most infamous murderers in American history. These are the forgotten monsters, the ones who slipped through the cracks of public consciousness, operating in plain sight while leaving trails of devastation that would shock even the most hardened true crime enthusiasts. Today, we're diving deep into the dark corners of criminal history to uncover 5 of the most evil serial killers you've probably never heard of. Samuel Little, who confessed to more murders than any serial killer in American history. Vicky Jackson, a nurse who turned her hospital into a hunting ground. John Norman Collins, who terrorized college campuses in Michigan. The mysterious West Mesa bone collector, whose identity remains unknown to this day. And Rory Enrique Conde, whose brutal crimes along Florida's highways earned him a chilling nickname. These aren't just stories about evil. They're windows into the darkest aspects of human nature, cases that reveal how society's most vulnerable become prey, and investigations that showcase both the failures and triumphs of law enforcement. Some of these killers were caught through brilliant detective work, others through sheer luck, and one remains at large, their crimes unsolved, their victims still crying out for justice. What makes these cases particularly disturbing isn't just the number of victims or the brutality of the crimes. It's how these killers managed to operate for years, sometimes decades, without detection. They exploited society's blind spots, targeting those whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive investigations. They understood that certain victims matter less to the system, and they used that knowledge to devastating effect. Samuel Little stands as perhaps the most prolific serial killer in American history, yet his name remains largely unknown to the general public. Born Samuel McDowell, this former boxer confessed to 93 murders committed between 1970 and 2005. The FBI has confirmed at least 60 of these murders, making him officially the most deadly serial killer ever documented in the United States. To put that in perspective, that's more confirmed kills than Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmer combined. Little's victims were almost exclusively women, specifically those living on the margins of society. Sex workers struggling with addiction, homeless women with no family ties, women whose disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate police investigations or media attention. Most of his victims were women of color, a factor that tragically contributed to why his crimes went undetected for so long. In many communities, the deaths of black women, particularly those involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, simply didn't receive the same level of scrutiny from law enforcement or media coverage. His method was as calculated as it was brutal. Little would strangle his victims, but he perfected a technique that left minimal forensic evidence. As a former boxer, he possessed immense physical strength and would often deliver a knockout punch before strangling them. This approach meant many deaths appeared non-suspicious, attributed to drug overdoses, accidents, or natural causes rather than homicide. The lack of obvious trauma made it easy for overworked coroners and police departments to close cases without extensive investigation. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Little's crimes was his nomadic lifestyle. He moved constantly across the United States, never staying in one location long enough to establish a clear pattern that local authorities could identify. He confessed to murders in at least 19 states, including California, Texas, Florida, Ohio, and Louisiana. This geographic spread fragmented investigations, preventing connections from being made between seemingly isolated cases across different jurisdictions. Little's ability to evade capture for over 3 decades speaks to a fundamental failure in how the justice system approaches certain types of victims. He understood that society had written off the women he targeted, and he exploited that negligence with ruthless efficiency. He once told investigators that he chose victims who wouldn't be missed, women who existed in the shadows where their absence might go unnoticed for weeks or months. His eventual capture in 2012 was almost anticlimactic. He was arrested on an outstanding drug charge in Kentucky, nothing related to his decades of murder. It was only when he was extradited to California that DNA evidence linked him to 3 cold case murders from the late 1980s. He was convicted in 2014 and sentenced to life without parole. But this was just the beginning of the true horror story. It wasn't until 2018, during extensive interviews with Texas Ranger James Holland, that Little began confessing to the staggering number of additional murders. What emerged from these interviews was both fascinating and terrifying. Little possessed an almost photographic memory for his crimes, able to recall intricate details about victims and locations from decades earlier. He could describe exactly what his victims were wearing, where he picked them up, how he killed them, and where he left their bodies. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Little drew portraits of many of his victims. These weren't crude sketches, but detailed, almost loving depictions that revealed an intimate knowledge of each woman's face. The FBI released many of these drawings to the public, hoping to identify additional victims and provide closure to families. Some of these portraits led to the identification of previously unknown victims, women whose deaths had been classified as accidents or overdoses, but were actually murders. The scope of Little's crimes is staggering, not just in numbers, but in geography and timeline. He operated across nearly 4 decades, from the early 1970s to the mid-2000s. His victims ranged from teenagers to elderly women, though most were between 20 and 40 years old. He claimed to have killed in major cities like Los Angeles, Houston, Miami, and New Orleans, as well as small towns across the American South and West. What makes Little's case particularly tragic is how many of these crimes could have been prevented if law enforcement had taken the disappearances of marginalized women more seriously. Families of victims had been reporting their loved ones missing for decades, only to be told that these women had probably just moved on or died from their addictions. The systemic devaluation of certain lives created the perfect hunting ground for a predator like Little. The investigation into Little's confessions became a massive undertaking, involving the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, state and local law enforcement agencies, and cold case units across the country. Investigators had to cross-reference his confessions with unsolved cases, travel to burial sites he described, and work with families who had been waiting decades for answers about their missing loved ones. Some of his confessions led to the discovery of remains in remote locations where he claimed to have dumped bodies. Others provided closure to families who had always suspected their loved one had been murdered but could never prove it. The painstaking work of verification continued right up until Little's death in prison in December 2020 at the age of 80. Samuel Little died with secrets still locked in his mind. While investigators confirmed 60 murders, they believe the actual number could be even higher. Some of his confessions couldn't be verified due to lack of physical evidence or records. Other cases remain open, with families still wondering if their missing loved one was among his victims. The legacy of Samuel Little's crimes extends far beyond the immediate horror of his actions. His case exposed massive gaps in how the justice system handles missing persons cases, particularly those involving marginalized communities. It highlighted the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies and more sophisticated methods for tracking patterns across jurisdictions. Perhaps most importantly, Little's case forced a reckoning with how society values certain lives over others. The fact that he could kill for decades without detection wasn't just about his cunning or mobility. It was about a system that had essentially written off his victims before they were even dead. Every woman he killed mattered to someone. Every death represented a life cut short, dreams unfulfilled, families left wondering what happened to their loved one. The investigation into Samuel Little's crimes continues even after his death. Cold case units across the country are still working to identify additional victims and provide closure to families. His case has become a template for how to investigate similar crimes and has led to changes in how missing persons cases are handled, particularly those involving vulnerable populations. But beyond the procedural changes in investigative techniques, Samuel Little's story serves as a stark reminder of the monsters that can hide in plain sight. For over 30 years, he moved through American society, appearing to be just another drifter, another face in the crowd. Meanwhile, he was systematically hunting and killing women, confident that their deaths wouldn't trigger the kind of investigation that might lead back to him. In the end, Samuel Little may have been one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, but his victims were far more than just numbers in his grotesque tally. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends. They were women who deserved better from the system that was supposed to protect them. Moving from the calculated horrors of Samuel Little's decades-long killing spree, we now turn to a different kind of predator, one who operated within the supposedly safe walls of a hospital. Vicky Jackson represents a particularly chilling category of serial killer, the healthcare worker who violates the most fundamental trust between caregiver and patient. Her story exposes the dark potential that exists when someone sworn to heal becomes someone who kills. Between December 2000 and February 2001, the small Nocona General Hospital in Nocona, Texas, experienced what staff initially attributed to an unfortunate but not entirely unusual phenomenon in rural healthcare, a cluster of elderly patient deaths. The hospital, serving a community of fewer than 3,000 people, had built a reputation for quality care despite its modest size. But something sinister was happening during the night shifts, something that would shatter the trust of an entire community. Vicky Jackson was a licensed vocational nurse, a professional entrusted with the care of the hospital's most vulnerable patients. At 45 years old, she had worked in healthcare for years, presenting herself as a dedicated caregiver who took pride in her work. Colleagues described her as competent and reliable, someone who seemed genuinely concerned about patient welfare. But beneath this professional facade lurked a predator who had discovered the perfect hunting ground. Jackson's victims were primarily elderly patients, ranging in age from 62 to 100 years old. These were people who had been admitted for relatively minor ailments, individuals whose families expected them to recover and return home. Instead, they became prey for a killer who had perfected a method of murder that was both sophisticated and nearly undetectable. She administered lethal doses of mivacurium chloride, a potent muscle paralytic drug that causes respiratory arrest while leaving the victim fully conscious and aware of what was happening. The horror of Jackson's method cannot be overstated. Mivacurium chloride paralyzes every muscle in the body, including those necessary for breathing, while leaving the victim's mind completely alert. Her victims would have experienced the ultimate terror, fully aware that they were dying but completely unable to move, speak, or call for help. They would have felt their lungs stop working, their hearts racing with panic, all while appearing to simply slip away peacefully to any observer. What made Jackson's crimes particularly insidious was how they mimicked natural death. In a hospital setting, elderly patients occasionally experience sudden deteriorations or complications that lead to death. Jackson exploited this reality, timing her attacks when she was alone with patients, then calmly alerting other staff members to their sudden decline. The deaths appeared as natural causes or medical emergencies, exactly what Jackson intended. The pattern began to emerge slowly. Hospital administrators noticed an unusual increase in patient mortality rates, particularly during certain shifts. At first, this was attributed to statistical variation or perhaps an unlucky streak with particularly ill patients. But as the numbers continued to climb, suspicions began to form. Staff members started whispering about the coincidences, about how certain patients who had seemed stable would suddenly deteriorate and die. The investigation that eventually exposed Jackson's crimes began with hospital staff raising concerns about the mortality patterns. Medical professionals, trained to notice anomalies, started questioning why so many patients were dying during specific shifts. The hospital administration, initially reluctant to believe that one of their own could be responsible, eventually had no choice but to involve law enforcement when the evidence became overwhelming. The breakthrough came when investigators found a syringe containing mivacurium chloride in Jackson's personal trash. This discovery was the smoking gun that transformed suspicion into certainty. The presence of this powerful paralytic agent, which had no legitimate reason for being in Jackson's possession outside of controlled medical procedures, provided the concrete evidence needed to move forward with charges. Following this discovery, authorities ordered the exhumation of several victims' bodies to test for the presence of mivacurium chloride. The process was both technically challenging and emotionally devastating for families who had believed their loved ones died natural deaths. Toxicology tests confirmed the presence of the lethal drug in multiple victims, providing the scientific evidence needed to build a case against Jackson. Jackson was arrested on July 16, 2002, initially charged with 4 counts of capital murder. Her bond was set at $2 million, reflecting both the severity of the charges and the perceived flight risk. As the investigation progressed and more bodies were exhumed and tested, additional charges were filed, bringing the total number of alleged murders to 10. Throughout the legal proceedings, Jackson maintained her innocence with a steadfast determination that frustrated investigators and prosecutors. She claimed that the evidence was circumstantial, that the deaths were natural, and that she was being scapegoated for the hospital's mortality issues. However, the scientific evidence was overwhelming, and the pattern of deaths corresponding to her shifts was too clear to ignore. The case presented unique challenges for prosecutors. Unlike typical serial killer cases involving obvious violence, Jackson's crimes required extensive medical and scientific testimony to explain how the murders were committed and why they initially appeared as natural deaths. Expert witnesses had to educate the jury about the effects of mivacurium chloride, the normal protocols for its use, and why its presence in the victims' bodies could only be explained by deliberate administration. Faced with mounting evidence and the prospect of a death sentence, Jackson eventually entered a plea of no contest to avoid a jury trial. This decision was reportedly motivated in part by her desire to prevent her daughter from having to testify against her, sparing her family additional trauma. The plea allowed Jackson to avoid admitting guilt while accepting the legal consequences of the charges. Jackson was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to harm patients under her care. The sentence brought a measure of justice for the victims' families, though many struggled with the knowledge that their loved ones' final moments were filled with terror rather than the peaceful deaths they had believed occurred. The Nocona General Hospital case highlighted critical vulnerabilities in healthcare settings that had previously received little attention. It demonstrated how a trusted healthcare worker could exploit their position to commit murder while hiding behind the natural expectation that elderly patients sometimes die unexpectedly. The case led to enhanced protocols for monitoring controlled substances, improved oversight of patient care, and greater awareness of the potential for healthcare serial killers. Jackson's crimes also exposed the psychological profile of healthcare serial killers, who often present as caring professionals while harboring deep-seated needs for control and power over life and death. Unlike killers who hunt strangers, healthcare serial killers exploit existing relationships of trust and vulnerability, making their crimes particularly betraying to both victims and the broader community. The impact on the families of Jackson's victims was profound and lasting. Many had to confront the devastating reality that their loved ones' deaths were not peaceful natural passings, but terrifying murders. The knowledge that these elderly individuals spent their final moments in conscious paralysis, unable to call for help while fully aware of their impending death, created a trauma that extended far beyond the immediate loss. The small community of Nocona struggled to process the revelation that such evil had operated within their trusted hospital. The facility, which had served as a cornerstone of local health care, became associated with betrayal and murder. Staff members who had worked alongside Jackson questioned their own judgment and wondered how they had failed to recognize the killer in their midst. The case continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the potential for abuse within healthcare settings. It demonstrates the importance of robust oversight systems, careful monitoring of controlled substances, and maintaining vigilance for unusual patterns in patient outcomes. Jackson's crimes remind us that evil can hide behind any facade, even that of a caring nurse, and that our most vulnerable populations require protection from those who would exploit their trust and helplessness. Vicky Jackson remains incarcerated, her life sentence ensuring that she will never again have access to vulnerable patients. Our third killer takes us to the college town of Ypsilanti, Michigan, in the late 1960s, where a charming young man with a disarming smile was about to turn the American Midwest into a hunting ground. This is the story of John Norman Collins, a predator who walked among his victims every single day, hiding in plain sight while terror gripped an entire community. The summer of 1967 was supposed to be a time of freedom and possibility for college students across Michigan. The Vietnam War raged overseas, but on the campuses of Eastern Michigan University and the University of Michigan, young people were embracing the counterculture movement, the music, the protests, the sense that anything was possible. For 19-year-old Mary Flesser, a psychology major at Eastern Michigan University, that summer represented independence. She had moved into her own apartment, was working part-time, and planning her future. She was smart, ambitious, and careful. She wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks. On July 9th, 1967, Mary left her apartment to walk to her job at a local clothing store. It was a route she had taken dozens of times before, through familiar streets lined with student housing and local businesses. She never made it to work. When her supervisor called her apartment that evening, there was no answer. When friends stopped by to check on her, they found her door unlocked, her purse sitting on the kitchen table, her car keys exactly where she had left them. Mary Flesser had simply vanished. For weeks, police and volunteers searched the area around Ypsilanti. They combed through woods, checked abandoned buildings, dragged ponds and rivers. The case made local headlines, but without any witnesses or obvious leads, the investigation began to stall. Then, on August 7th, almost a month after Mary's disappearance, two teenagers exploring a wooded area north of town made a discovery that would haunt them forever. What they found wasn't immediately recognizable as human remains. The body had been severely mutilated, not just by natural decomposition, but by something far more deliberate and sinister. The hands and feet had been removed entirely. The face was so badly damaged that identification was only possible through dental records. But the most disturbing detail was what investigators found scattered around the body. Women's clothing that didn't belong to Mary, suggesting this wasn't the killer's first victim. The brutality of Mary Flesser's murder sent shockwaves through the community, but it was only the beginning. Over the next 2 years, the killer would strike again and again, each time growing bolder, more vicious, more confident in his ability to evade capture. His victims were all young women, all attractive, all living the typical lives of college students in small-town America. They were daughters, sisters, friends, young women with dreams and futures that would never be realized. Joan Schell was 20 years old when she disappeared in June 1968. She'd been walking to a friend's house when someone offered her a ride. Her body was found 3 days later in a cemetery, raped and stabbed 47 times. The killer had posed her body in a deliberate, taunting manner, as if sending a message to investigators. Jane Mixer, a law student at the University of Michigan, was found shot in the head in March 1969. Marilyn Skelton, 13 years old, was beaten to death with a belt and left in a stream. With each new victim, the terror in the community grew more palpable. Parents began driving their daughters everywhere. College women traveled in groups, never alone, never after dark. Gun sales spiked. Self-defense classes filled up immediately. The local media dubbed the perpetrator the co-ed killer, and his crimes dominated headlines across Michigan and beyond. The FBI was called in to assist local police, but the killer remained one step ahead of every investigative effort. What made the case so terrifying wasn't just the brutality of the murders, but the randomness of the victim selection. These weren't women involved in high-risk activities or dangerous lifestyles. They were ordinary college students, walking to work, visiting friends, living normal lives in what should have been a safe community. The killer could strike anywhere, at any time, and no one seemed to be able to stop him. The investigation consumed hundreds of hours of police work and thousands of dollars in resources. Detectives interviewed hundreds of suspects, followed up on thousands of tips, and pursued every possible lead. They brought in psychologists to create a profile of the killer, organized massive search parties, and even consulted with other law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases. But the killer remained a ghost, leaving behind only mutilated bodies and a community paralyzed by fear. What no one realized was that the killer was hiding in plain sight, living and working among the very people he was terrorizing. John Norman Collins was a 22-year-old student at Eastern Michigan University, majoring in elementary education. He lived in a dormitory just blocks from where several of his victims had last been seen alive. He was handsome, charismatic, and popular with both men and women. He played intramural sports, dated regularly, and maintained good grades. To everyone who knew him, he seemed like the ideal college student. Collins was also smart enough to insert himself into the investigation in subtle ways. He would show up at crime scenes as a concerned citizen, offering to help with searches or asking police officers about their progress. He would discuss the murders with classmates and friends, expressing shock and outrage at the killer's actions. He even attended some of the victims' funerals, presenting himself as a member of the grieving community. This behavior allowed him to stay informed about the investigation's progress while simultaneously deflecting any suspicion from himself. The breakthrough in the case came on July 23, 1969, when 18-year-old Karen Sue Beineman disappeared after leaving her job at a wig shop in downtown Ypsilanti. Unlike previous victims, Karen's disappearance was witnessed by several people who saw her accept a ride from a young man on a motorcycle. The witnesses were able to provide a detailed description of both the rider and the motorcycle, giving police their first solid lead in over 2 years. The description led investigators to John Collins, who owned a motorcycle matching the witnesses' accounts. When police questioned him, Collins initially denied any involvement, but seemed nervous and evasive. His alibi for the time of Karen's disappearance was weak and contradictory. More importantly, When police searched his uncle's house where Collins had been staying, they found microscopic evidence that would ultimately seal his fate. In the basement of the house, crime scene investigators discovered tiny fragments of fabric and hair that matched evidence found with Karen Beineman's body. They also found traces of a unique yellow paint that had been used to mark items in the basement. This same paint was discovered on Karen's clothing, creating an undeniable forensic link between Collins and the murder. The evidence was microscopic, invisible to the naked eye, but under scientific analysis, it was conclusive proof of Collins's guilt. During his interrogation, Collins maintained his innocence, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic analysis linked him definitively to Karen Beineman's murder, and circumstantial evidence suggested his involvement in the other killings. Witnesses placed him near several crime scenes. His behavior during the investigation had been suspicious and inconsistent. Most damning of all, the murders stopped completely after his arrest, suggesting that police had indeed captured the co-ed killer. The trial of John Norman Collins began in June 1970 and became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Michigan history. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer who had terrorized an entire community for over 2 years. They presented the forensic evidence, linking Collins to Karen Beineman's murder, and argued that the pattern of killings clearly indicated the work of a serial killer. The defense attempted to challenge the scientific evidence and create reasonable doubt about Collins's guilt, but their efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. On August 19, 1970, John Norman Collins was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Karen Sue Beineman and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Although he was only convicted of one murder, investigators believed he was responsible for at least 6 additional killings in the Michigan area and possibly more in other states. The conviction brought a sense of relief to the terrorized community, but the trauma of the co-ed killer's reign of terror would linger for decades. What made Collins so dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, but his ability to blend seamlessly into normal society. He understood how to manipulate people's perceptions of him, how to appear trustworthy and harmless while concealing his true nature. He was educated, articulate, and socially skilled, which allowed him to approach victims without arousing suspicion. This combination of intelligence and ruthlessness made him one of the most effective predators of his era. The case also highlighted the challenges law enforcement faced when dealing with serial killers who operated across multiple jurisdictions. Collins' crimes occurred in different cities and counties, which initially hampered the investigation as different agencies worked independently rather than sharing information and resources. The co-ed killer case became a model for how future serial killer investigations should be conducted, emphasizing the importance of interagency cooperation and centralized information sharing. Collins has remained in prison for over 50 years, consistently maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. He has never confessed to any of the murders, never expressed remorse for his actions, and never provided closure to the families of his victims. His refusal to acknowledge his crimes has been particularly painful for the families who have been denied the full truth about their loved ones' final moments. The impact of the co-ed killer case extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. It fundamentally changed how people thought about safety in small college towns, shattering the illusion that such communities were immune to violent crime. It also influenced popular culture, inspiring books, documentaries, and films about serial killers and their impact on society. The case demonstrated that evil could wear a familiar face, that monsters could walk among us undetected, and that the most dangerous predators were often those who appeared the most normal. Today, John Norman Collins remains imprisoned in Michigan, a forgotten relic of a time when serial killers seemed like something from horror movies rather than real life. But his victims are not forgotten. Now we turn to one of the most chilling aspects of serial murder: killers who hide in plain sight, using their professional positions as shields while they destroy lives. Vicky Jackson represents every patient's worst nightmare, a healthcare worker who transformed healing spaces into hunting grounds, wielding medical knowledge as a weapon against the most vulnerable. Between December 2000 and February 2001, the small community of Nocona, Texas, experienced something that defied explanation. At Nocona General Hospital, elderly patients who had been admitted for routine care or minor ailments were suddenly dying at an alarming rate. These weren't critically ill individuals clinging to life. These were stable patients, some recovering from simple procedures, others admitted for observation. Yet within hours or days of their arrival, they would suffer unexpected respiratory failure and die. The hospital staff initially attributed the deaths to the natural fragility of elderly patients. After all, medical emergencies can happen anywhere, anytime. But as the weeks passed, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The deaths weren't random. They clustered around specific shifts, specific times, and most disturbingly, they seemed to follow the presence of one particular nurse, Vicky Jackson. Jackson was a licensed vocational nurse who had worked at various medical facilities throughout Texas. To her colleagues, she appeared competent and caring, someone who had chosen a profession dedicated to healing and comfort. She was married, had children, and seemed to embody the nurturing qualities expected in healthcare. But beneath this facade lurked something far more sinister. Jackson wasn't just present during these mysterious deaths, she was orchestrating them. Her weapon of choice was mivacurium chloride, a powerful muscle paralytic drug used during surgical procedures to prevent muscle movement. In the hands of a trained medical professional, it's a valuable tool. In Jackson's hands, it became an instrument of murder. When injected into a patient, mivacurium chloride causes complete muscle paralysis, including the diaphragm, leading to respiratory arrest. The victim remains conscious, but cannot move, cannot breathe, and cannot call for help. They suffocate while fully aware of what's happening to them. The genius of Jackson's method was its invisibility. Respiratory failure in elderly patients isn't uncommon, and mivacurium chloride metabolizes quickly, leaving minimal traces in standard toxicology screenings. The deaths appeared natural, or at worst, like medical complications. No one suspected murder because murder seemed impossible in such a controlled professional environment. But Jackson's killing spree couldn't remain hidden forever. Hospital administrators began noticing the statistical anomaly. Too many patients were dying during Jackson's shifts. The mortality rate during her work periods was significantly higher than average, a red flag that couldn't be ignored. Internal discussions began, quiet at first, then more urgent as the pattern became undeniable. The investigation that followed was methodical and horrifying. Authorities examined patient records, shift schedules, and medication logs. They interviewed staff members and reviewed security footage. Most crucially, they began testing for substances that wouldn't appear in routine post-mortem examinations. The breakthrough came when investigators found a syringe containing mivacurium chloride in Jackson's personal trash, a smoking gun that linked her directly to the method of murder. As the investigation deepened, the true scope of Jackson's crimes became clear. At least 10 patients had been murdered, ranging in age from 62 to 100 years old. These were grandparents, great-grandparents, people who had lived full lives and deserved to die peacefully, surrounded by loved ones. Instead, they died alone, paralyzed and terrified, at the hands of someone they trusted to care for them. The victims included Opal Few, an 88-year-old woman who had been admitted for a routine procedure. There was Ernest Rhodes, 78 years old, recovering from minor surgery. Zordia Anderson, 83, had been in stable condition before Jackson's intervention. Each name represented not just a life lost, but a family destroyed, children and grandchildren left wondering how their loved one could have deteriorated so quickly in what should have been a safe environment. Jackson's motives remain largely unclear, adding another layer of horror to her crimes. Unlike serial killers who target strangers on the street, Jackson murdered people who were completely helpless, who had placed their trust in her professional care. Some experts speculate she suffered from what's known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychological disorder where caregivers harm those in their care to gain attention or sympathy. Others suggest she derived a sense of power from controlling life and death, playing God with vulnerable patients who couldn't defend themselves. The arrest of Vicky Jackson on July 16, 2002, sent shockwaves through the small town of Nocona and the broader medical community. How could someone sworn to do no harm commit such calculated acts of violence? How many other healthcare workers might be hiding similar dark impulses? The case shattered the fundamental trust between patients and caregivers, a trust that forms the foundation of all medical treatment. During the legal proceedings, Jackson maintained her innocence, even as evidence mounted against her. The prosecution had the syringe, the statistical evidence of increased deaths during her shifts, and the testimony of colleagues who had begun to suspect something was wrong. To avoid a jury trial and prevent her own daughter from having to testify against her, Jackson eventually pleaded no contest to the charges. The sentencing phase revealed the full extent of the devastation Jackson had caused. Family members of victims delivered impact statements describing their confusion and grief. They talked about loved ones who had been looking forward to going home, who had been making plans for the future, who had been stolen from them by someone they never suspected. The judge sentenced Jackson to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring she could never again harm vulnerable patients. Jackson's case highlighted critical vulnerabilities in the healthcare system. How do hospitals monitor for internal threats? How can families protect their loved ones from those meant to protect them? The case led to enhanced monitoring systems, better tracking of medication usage, and increased awareness of healthcare serial killers, a disturbing but real phenomenon that had claimed victims in hospitals across the country. The psychological profile of healthcare serial killers, like Jackson, reveals disturbing patterns. They often appear to be model employees, dedicated to their profession and respected by colleagues. They choose victims who are already sick or elderly, making suspicious deaths easier to explain. They use their medical knowledge to select methods that are difficult to detect. Most chillingly, they exploit the ultimate vulnerability, targeting people who cannot fight back, cannot escape, and cannot even comprehend what's happening to them. Today, Vicky Jackson remains imprisoned, her license to practice nursing permanently revoked. The families of her victims continue to live with the trauma of knowing their loved ones' final moments were filled with terror and betrayal. The case serves as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind any facade, even the white coat of a trusted healthcare provider. The Nocona General Hospital case also exposed broader systemic issues in healthcare oversight. How many other Vicky Jacksons might be operating in hospitals across the country? How many suspicious deaths are dismissed as natural when they might actually be murder? The questions raised by Jackson's crimes continue to haunt the medical community, driving ongoing efforts to develop better detection systems and prevent future tragedies. Jackson's crimes represent a particular kind of evil, one that perverts the healing profession and transforms places of hope into scenes of horror. Her victims were among society's most vulnerable, elderly patients who had every right to expect care and comfort in their final days. Now let's turn our attention to the West Mesa of Albuquerque, New Mexico, where one of America's most haunting unsolved cases continues to baffle investigators and torment families more than a decade after its discovery. In February 2009, a woman walking her dog stumbled upon what would become one of the largest crime scenes in New Mexico's history. What started as a single bone protruding from the desert sand would soon reveal the burial ground of an unidentified serial killer known only as the West Mesa Bone Collector. The discovery began innocuously enough on February the 2nd, 2009. Kristen Ross was walking her dog in an undeveloped area of Albuquerque's West Mesa when her pet began acting strangely, pawing at something in the dirt. When Christine looked closer, she saw what appeared to be a human bone jutting from the earth. Her call to police would trigger one of the most extensive forensic investigations in New Mexico's history. Within hours of Christine's discovery, the Albuquerque Police Department had cordoned off the area and begun a systematic excavation. What they found defied their worst expectations. Buried in shallow graves across this desolate stretch of desert were the skeletal remains of 11 women and one unborn child. The victims had been carefully buried in a grid-like pattern, suggesting meticulous planning and a killer who had intimate knowledge of this remote location. The burial site itself was chilling in its organization. The graves were arranged in neat rows, each victim placed approximately 15 feet apart from the others. This wasn't the work of someone disposing of bodies haphazardly. This was methodical, calculated, and deeply disturbing. The killer had taken time to create what investigators would later describe as a personal cemetery, returning to this same location repeatedly over several years. As forensic teams worked to identify the remains, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. The victims were predominantly young Hispanic women, ranging in age from 15 to 32. Most had connections to Albuquerque's Central Avenue corridor, an area known for drug activity and sex work. These were society's most vulnerable individuals, women whose disappearances often went unreported or were not aggressively investigated due to their lifestyle and the circumstances of their lives. The youngest victim was Selania Edwards, just 15 years old when she vanished. Selania was a runaway from Oklahoma, the only African American victim among the group, and the only one from outside New Mexico. Her presence in the burial ground suggested the killer's reach extended beyond Albuquerque's immediate area. Michelle Valdez, another victim, was 4 months pregnant when she died, making her unborn child the 12th victim in this devastating case. Investigators so quickly realized they were dealing with crimes that had occurred years earlier. Satellite imagery analysis revealed that the last burial had taken place around 2005, meaning these women had been missing for years before their remains were discovered. The advanced state of decomposition made determining exact causes of death nearly impossible in most cases, though investigators ruled all deaths homicides based on the circumstances of their burial. The victims' identities told a heartbreaking story of lives cut short. Doreen Marquez was 28 when she disappeared in 2004. Her family had reported her missing, but like so many cases involving women with histories of drug use, the investigation had gone cold. Veronica Romero was 28 and pregnant when she vanished in 2004. Her family never stopped searching for her, posting flyers and pleading with police for answers that wouldn't come for 5 more years. Jamie Barella was 15 when she disappeared in 2004, just days after being released from a juvenile detention facility. Her mother had been frantically searching for her, but Jamie's involvement with drugs and older men had put her in dangerous situations. Virginia Cloven was 24 when she vanished in 2004, leaving behind a young daughter who would grow up never knowing what happened to her mother. The investigation into the West Mesa murders became one of the largest in Albuquerque Police Department history. A task force was formed, combining resources from local, state, and federal agencies. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to develop a profile of the unknown killer. Ground-penetrating radar was used to search for additional burial sites. Every lead was followed, every tip investigated, every possible connection explored. Despite these extensive efforts, the West Mesa bone collector remains unidentified. The killer's methodical approach and the remote location of the burial site suggest someone with intimate knowledge of Albuquerque's geography and patterns of police patrol. The fact that the killer was able to transport and bury 12 victims over several years without detection indicates either exceptional luck or careful planning and surveillance. Several persons of interest have been investigated over the years. One was a local man with a history of violence against sex workers who died in 2006. Another was a long-haul trucker who frequented the Central Avenue area and had connections to several of the victims. However, despite intensive investigation, no arrests have ever been made. The lack of physical evidence and the advanced decomposition of the remains has made building a prosecutable case nearly impossible. The geographic pattern of the crimes suggests the killer was familiar with Albuquerque's layout and the routines of women working along Central Avenue. The burial site, while remote, was still within city limits and easily accessible by vehicle. This wasn't someone passing through town. This was likely a local resident. someone who blended into the community and understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities of his chosen victims. The psychological profile developed by the FBI suggests the killer was likely a white or Hispanic male, aged 25 to 40 during the time of the murders. He would have appeared normal to neighbors and co-workers, possibly holding steady employment that gave him flexibility in his schedule. The organized nature of the burial site indicates above average intelligence and the ability to plan complex activities over extended periods. What makes this case particularly haunting is how the killer was able to target society's most vulnerable members with apparent impunity. These women existed on the margins, their disappearances often attributed to the dangerous lifestyle associated with drugs and sex work rather than foul play. The killer understood this dynamic and exploited it, knowing that missing persons reports might not be filed immediately, and when they were, investigations might not receive the same priority as other cases. The families of the victims have never stopped fighting for justice. They've organized searches, pressured police for updates, and kept their loved ones' stories alive in the media. Their persistence has been crucial in keeping the case active and ensuring that the West Mesa murders remain a priority for law enforcement. In 2010, the case gained national attention when it was featured on America's Most Wanted. The exposure generated hundreds of tips, but none led to an arrest. Subsequent media coverage, including documentaries and true crime podcasts, has kept the case in the public eye, but the killer's identity remains a mystery. The investigation has revealed troubling patterns in how society responds to crimes against marginalized populations. The victim's involvement with drugs and sex work initially led to less media attention and public concern than might have been generated by victims from different backgrounds. This disparity in attention and resources highlights systemic issues in how missing persons cases are prioritized and investigated. Today, the West Mesa Task Force remains active, though with reduced resources compared to the initial investigation. Cold case detectives continue to review evidence, follow up on tips, and explore new investigative techniques. Advances in DNA analysis and genealogical databases offer hope that someday the killer might be identified, even if he's no longer alive. The empty lot where the bodies were discovered has since been developed into a residential neighborhood. Families now live where this killer once buried his victims, largely unaware of the tragedy that unfolded beneath their homes. A small memorial exists nearby, honoring the victims and serving as a reminder that their stories haven't been forgotten. The West Mesa Bone Collector case represents one of the most significant unsolved serial killer investigations in American history. 12 lives were lost, 12 families were shattered, and a community was forever changed by the actions of someone who remains hidden in plain sight. The killer demonstrated a level of organization and patience that allowed him to operate for years without detection, exploiting societal blind spots and the vulnerabilities of women living on society's margins. Whether the West Mesa Bone Collector is still alive, still in Albuquerque, or has moved on to commit crimes elsewhere remains unknown. What is certain is that somewhere, someone knows something about these murders. The killer didn't operate in complete isolation. Someone may have noticed unusual behavior, unexplained absences, or suspicious activities during the years these crimes were committed. The case serves as a stark reminder of how serial killers can exploit societal inequalities and law enforcement blind spots to operate with devastating effectiveness. It also demonstrates the importance of treating all missing persons cases with equal priority, regardless of the victim's background or lifestyle. Every person deserves to be searched for, mourned, and remembered. As investigators continue their work and families continue their wait for justice, the West Mesa murders stand as a testament to both the darkest capabilities of human nature and the enduring power of hope. Someday, the families believe they will have answers. Rory Enrique Conde earned the nickname the Tamiami Trail Strangler for good reason. Between September 1994 and January 1995, this cold-blooded killer turned a stretch of Florida highway into his personal dumping ground, leaving 6 bodies scattered along the roadside like discarded trash. What made Conde particularly dangerous wasn't just his brutality, but his ability to blend into the shadows of Miami's underworld, preying on those society often overlooked. Born in Cuba in 1965, Conde immigrated to the United States as a child, settling in Miami, where he would eventually become a maintenance worker and part-time security guard. To neighbors and co-workers, he appeared unremarkable, just another face in the crowd trying to make ends meet. But beneath this ordinary exterior lurked a man consumed by rage, sexual violence, and a twisted need for control that would soon manifest in the most horrific ways imaginable. The killing spree began in September 1994 with the murder of Lázaro Comisana, a 26-year-old cross-dressing male prostitute. Conde had picked up Comisana, believing he was a woman, and when he discovered the truth during their encounter, his reaction was swift and deadly. He strangled Comisana in a violent rage, then dumped the body along the Tamiami Trail. This first murder wasn't planned, but it awakened something dark in Conde, a realization that he could kill and get away with it. What followed was a methodical campaign of terror targeting Miami's most vulnerable population. Conde began cruising the streets late at night, hunting for prostitutes who worked the dangerous corners and truck stops along major highways. His victims were women struggling with addiction, poverty, and desperation, women who climbed into strangers' cars because they had no other choice. They trusted him enough to go with him, and that trust cost them their lives. His second victim was Elisa Martinez, a 30-year-old mother of 2 who had been working the streets to support her drug habit. Conde lured her to a cheap motel room where he strangled her with his bare hands, then violated her corpse before disposing of her body along the same stretch of highway where he'd left Comisana. The pattern was established, and Conde was just getting started. Over the next 4 months, the bodies continued to pile up. Charity Phi Nava, 26 years old, was found strangled and dumped in a canal. Wanda Cook Crawford, 39, was discovered along the roadside, her body showing signs of the same brutal treatment. Nicole Schneider, just 22, was found in a vacant lot, another victim of Conde's insatiable appetite for violence. Each murder followed the same sick ritual: strangulation, sexual assault of the corpse, and disposal along the Tamiami Trail. The Miami police were baffled by the string of murders. The victims all came from the same high-risk lifestyle, and their deaths were initially treated as isolated incidents rather than the work of a serial killer. This was exactly what Conde was counting on. He understood that society's indifference to prostitutes would buy him time, and he was right. The investigation moved slowly, hampered by a lack of witnesses and the transient nature of the victims' lives. But Conde's arrogance would prove to be his downfall. In January 1995, he claimed his final victim, Rhonda Dunn, a 23-year-old woman who had been trying to get her life back on track. Like the others, she was strangled and dumped along the highway, but by this time, police had begun to see the connections between the murders. The similar method of killing, the geographic clustering of the dump sites, and the shared characteristics of the victims all pointed to a single perpetrator. The breakthrough came in June 1995, not through brilliant detective work, but through sheer luck. Fire rescue personnel responded to a call at Conde's apartment and discovered a woman bound and gagged with duct tape, barely alive. She had been tortured and sexually assaulted, and it was clear that Conde had been preparing to kill her when something interrupted his plans. When police searched his apartment, they found evidence linking him to the Tamiami Trail murders, personal items belonging to the victims, rope and duct tape matching materials found at crime scenes, and most damning of all, photographs of some of the victims. Under interrogation, Conde initially denied involvement in the murders, but the evidence was overwhelming. DNA analysis confirmed his connection to the crimes, and faced with the prospect of the death penalty, he eventually confessed to all 6 murders. His confession revealed the full extent of his depravity, including details about his necrophilic activities that investigators had suspected but couldn't prove. During his confession, Conde claimed that his killing spree was triggered by his separation from his wife, as if marital problems could somehow justify the brutal murder of 6 innocent people. He described each killing in chilling detail, showing no remorse for his actions, only concern for his own fate. He spoke about his victims as if they were objects rather than human beings, referring to them by their physical characteristics rather than their names. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and drawn out. Conde was tried separately for each murder, with prosecutors seeking the death penalty in multiple cases. The first trial, for the murder of Rhonda Dunn, resulted in a death sentence in March 2000. For the remaining 5 murders, Conde pleaded guilty and received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The death sentence was later overturned on appeal, but Conde remains locked away in a Florida prison, serving multiple life terms that ensure he will never see freedom again. His case highlighted the particular vulnerability of sex workers to violent predators and the challenges law enforcement faces when investigating crimes against marginalized populations. The families of Conde's victims struggled not only with their grief, but with the stigma attached to their loved ones' lifestyles. These weren't just prostitutes or drug addicts, they were daughters, mothers, and sisters who had fallen on hard times. Elisa Martinez left behind 2 young children who would grow up without their mother. Rhonda Dunn had been trying to turn her life around when Conde ended it. Each victim had a story, dreams, and people who loved them, but their deaths received little media attention compared to other murder cases. The Tamiami Trail strangler case also revealed disturbing patterns in how society responds to violence against sex workers. The slow pace of the initial investigation, the lack of public outcry, and the minimal media coverage all reflected deep-seated biases about who deserves protection and justice. Conde understood these biases and exploited them, counting on society's indifference to give him time to kill again and again. What makes Conde's crimes particularly chilling is the calculated nature of his violence. These weren't crimes of passion or momentary rage. They were premeditated acts of sadistic brutality. He would drive around for hours looking for victims, carefully selecting women who fit his preferred profile. He would engage them in conversation, negotiate prices, and lure them to secluded locations where he could kill them without interruption. The necrophilic aspect of his crimes added another layer of horror, demonstrating a level of depravity that defies comprehension. Today, Rory Enrique Conde sits in a Florida prison cell, a forgotten monster whose crimes terrorized Miami's streets for 5 horrific months. His case serves as a stark reminder of the predators who lurk in society's shadows, waiting to exploit the vulnerable and desperate. The Tamiami Trail, once a symbol of Florida's growth and progress, became synonymous with death and terror, a dumping ground for the victims of one man's twisted fantasies. The investigation into Conde's crimes also led to improvements in how law enforcement handles cases involving sex workers and other marginalized populations. Police departments began to recognize that serial killers often target these vulnerable groups precisely because they know society won't immediately notice or care when they disappear. The investigation into the West Mesa bone collector case represents one of the most challenging and heartbreaking unsolved serial killer cases in modern American history. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the scale of the murders, but the systematic way an unknown predator targeted some of society's most vulnerable women while managing to remain completely invisible to law enforcement for years. The discovery began on what seemed like an ordinary February morning in 2009. Christine Ross was walking her dog on the undeveloped West Mesa of Albuquerque, New Mexico, when her pet became agitated near a small arroyo. What she found protruding from the sandy soil would uncover one of the largest crime scenes in New Mexico's history. A single human bone, bleached white by years of desert sun, was just the beginning. Within hours of Ross's call to police, investigators realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than a single death. As they carefully excavated the area, more bones emerged from the shallow graves, then more and more. By the time the massive investigation concluded, the remains of 11 women and 1 unborn child had been recovered from what would become known as the West Mesa burial site. The victims shared devastating similarities that painted a clear picture of the killer's hunting preferences. Almost all were Hispanic women between the ages of 15 and 32. Most struggled with drug addiction and were involved in prostitution to survive on Albuquerque's streets. They were women whose disappearances had gone largely unnoticed by a society that had already marginalized them. Their names were Selenia Edwards, just 15 years old and the only African-American victim; Jamie Barella, only 15 herself; Monica Candelaria, 19; Victoria Chavez, 26; Virginia Cloven, 24; Cinnamon Elks, 32; Doreen Marquez, 28; Julie Nieto, 24; Veronica Romero, 28; Michelle Valdez, 22 and 4 months pregnant when she died; and Gina Valdez, just 22. These weren't just statistics or case numbers. They were daughters, sisters, Mothers. Some had children who waited for them to come home. Others had families who filed missing person reports that seemed to disappear into bureaucratic limbo. The tragic reality is that many of these women had been missing for years before their remains were discovered, and in some cases, their disappearances hadn't even been reported. The forensic investigation revealed chilling details about the killer's methodology. Satellite imagery analysis showed that the murders likely occurred between 2003 and 2005, with the burial site being actively used during this period. The killer had chosen the location carefully. The West Mesa was an isolated area of desert scrubland on Albuquerque's outskirts, far from residential areas but still within the city limits. It was the kind of place where someone could work undisturbed, digging shallow graves under the cover of darkness. What made the case even more challenging was the advanced state of decomposition of the remains. Years of exposure to the harsh desert climate had reduced most of the bodies to skeletal remains, making it difficult to determine exact causes of death. However, investigators were able to confirm that all deaths were homicides, and the systematic burial pattern suggested a single perpetrator operating with methodical precision. The investigation became one of the largest in New Mexico's history, involving multiple agencies, including the Albuquerque Police Department, the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI. Hundreds of investigators worked thousands of hours, following up on tips, interviewing potential witnesses, and analyzing evidence. They created detailed timelines of each victim's last known whereabouts, mapped the killer's potential hunting grounds, and developed psychological profiles of the perpetrator. Despite these massive efforts, the West Mesa bone collector has never been identified. The case remains one of the most frustrating unsolved serial killer investigations in the country, with investigators following numerous leads that ultimately led nowhere. Several persons of interest have been investigated over the years, including men with histories of violence against women, but none have yielded sufficient evidence for charges. One of the most promising leads involved Lorenzo Montoya, a known violent offender who was killed in 2006 during a confrontation with police after allegedly attacking a sex worker. Montoya lived near the burial site and had a history of violence against prostitutes, making him a compelling suspect. However, investigators were never able to definitively link him to the West Mesa murders, and his death meant they couldn't question him directly about the crimes. The case highlighted systemic issues within law enforcement's approach to crimes involving marginalized populations. Many of the victims had been reported missing, but their cases received minimal investigation resources. The harsh reality is that when women involved in prostitution and drug use disappear, their cases often don't receive the same level of attention as other missing persons cases. This societal bias likely contributed to the killer's ability to operate undetected for years. The impact on the victims' families has been profound and ongoing. Many had spent years wondering what happened to their loved ones, holding on to hope that they might still be alive. The discovery of the remains brought a form of closure, but also devastating confirmation of their worst fears. For some families, the remains found at West Mesa provided the first concrete information they'd received about their missing daughters in years. Maria Chavez, the mother of victim Victoria Chavez, became one of the most vocal advocates for the victims and their families. She organized vigils, pressed for continued investigation, and fought to ensure that her daughter and the other victims were remembered as more than just crime statistics. Her advocacy helped keep public attention focused on the case and demonstrated the profound love these women had inspired in their families, despite their struggles. The investigation also revealed the dangerous world these women navigated daily. Albuquerque's war zone, as locals called certain areas of the city, was plagued by poverty, addiction, and violence. Women working the streets faced constant danger from clients, law enforcement, and predators like the West Mesa bone collector. The murders represented an extreme manifestation of the violence these vulnerable women faced regularly. Investigators believe the killer likely had knowledge of the West Mesa area and may have used it for other purposes before selecting it as a burial ground. The location required someone who knew the terrain, understood when the area would be deserted, and had reliable transportation to move bodies from the city to the desert. This suggests someone who was either local to Albuquerque or had spent considerable time in the area. The psychological profile developed by the FBI suggested the killer was likely a white or Hispanic male, probably in his 30s or 40s during the time of the murders. He would have appeared normal to those who knew him, possibly holding down a job and maintaining relationships. The methodical nature of the burials suggested someone organized and patient, capable of long-term planning. The targeting of vulnerable women indicated someone who felt comfortable in the world of drugs and prostitution, either as a participant or someone who understood how to navigate it. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case is the possibility that the killer is still alive and potentially active elsewhere. Serial killers rarely stop killing voluntarily, and the abrupt end to the West Mesa burials in 2005 suggests the perpetrator either died and was incarcerated for other crimes or moved to a different location. Law enforcement agencies across the country have been alerted to watch for similar patterns of missing women and burial sites. The case has also highlighted advances in forensic technology and investigative techniques. DNA evidence has been collected from the remains, and investigators continue to run it against databases as new profiles are added. Genealogical DNA analysis, which has proven successful in other cold cases, represents a potential breakthrough avenue for the investigation. As we reflect on the West Mesa bone collector case, we're confronted with uncomfortable truths about how society values different lives. These 11 women deserved protection, investigation, and justice just as much as any other victims. Their deaths represent not just individual tragedies, but a systemic failure to protect the most vulnerable members of our community. The investigation remains active, with the Albuquerque Police Department maintaining a dedicated task force and regularly reviewing evidence as new technologies become available. The families of the victims continue to seek answers, and the community continues to demand justice. Somewhere out there, either in a grave or still walking free, is someone who knows exactly what happened to these women. What makes these cases particularly haunting is not just the brutality of the crimes, but how they expose the cracks in our society's safety net. Each of these killers operated within systems that should have protected their victims, yet failed catastrophically. The marginalized populations they targeted often existed in shadows where their disappearances went unnoticed, their deaths uninvestigated, and their lives undervalued. The systematic nature of these failures becomes even more chilling when we examine the aftermath. Samuel Little's victims were dismissed as drug overdoses or natural deaths for decades. The women buried on West Mesa were written off as runaways who simply vanished into the night. Vicky Jackson's elderly patients died in what should have been the safest place possible, a hospital, yet their deaths were accepted without question. John Norman Collins terrorized college campuses while maintaining the facade of a normal student. Rory Conde preyed on sex workers whose disappearances barely registered with authorities. These cases reveal uncomfortable truths about how our society values different lives. The homeless, the addicted, the elderly, sex workers, and other vulnerable populations become invisible targets for predators who understand that their crimes against these victims will receive less attention, less resources, and less urgency from law enforcement. This isn't necessarily malicious intent from investigators, but rather a reflection of broader societal biases that determine whose life matters most when they go missing or turn up dead. The geographic spread of these crimes also highlights another disturbing pattern. Samuel Little's cross-country killing spree was enabled by poor communication between jurisdictions and the lack of centralized databases that could have connected his crimes earlier. The West Mesa bone collector operated in a sprawling desert landscape where bodies could remain hidden for years. These killers understood the geography of invisibility, choosing locations and victims that would minimize their chances of detection. Perhaps most disturbing is how long some of these killers operated before being caught. Samuel Little murdered for 35 years before his final arrest. The West Mesa bone collector has never been identified, despite extensive investigations. Vicky Jackson killed 10 patients in just 2 months before anyone noticed the pattern. These extended timelines represent countless missed opportunities for intervention, countless lives that could have been saved if the warning signs had been recognized sooner. The psychological profiles of these killers also reveal common threads that make their stories particularly unsettling. Many exhibited the classic triad of childhood warning signs: bedwetting, animal cruelty, and fire setting, yet these early indicators went unaddressed. They often maintained normal facades while committing horrific crimes, demonstrating a level of compartmentalization that allowed them to function in society while secretly destroying lives. This dual existence makes them even more terrifying because it suggests that monsters don't always look like monsters. The investigation techniques that eventually brought some of these killers to justice represent both the evolution of forensic science and the dedication of investigators who refused to give up on cold cases. DNA evidence, improved databases, and better interagency communication have made it harder for serial killers to operate undetected for extended periods. The FBI's VICAP system, which helped identify many of Samuel Little's victims, exemplifies how technology can finally give voice to the silenced dead. Yet for every case that gets solved, others remain mysteries. The West Mesa bone collector's identity continues to elude investigators despite advanced forensic techniques and extensive resources. This ongoing mystery serves as a reminder that not all monsters are caught, not all families receive closure, and not all victims receive justice. The unknown killer could still be out there, could have moved to another location, could be operating under everyone's radar once again. The impact on communities cannot be understated. These killers didn't just destroy individual lives, they shattered entire communities' sense of security. College towns became places of fear rather than learning. Hospital patients and their families lost trust in the very institution meant to heal them. Vulnerable populations became even more isolated as fear drove them further underground, making them paradoxically more susceptible to predators. The families of victims carry scars that never fully heal. Some received answers after decades of uncertainty, while others continue to live with unresolved questions. The mothers, fathers, children, and siblings of these victims represent the true human cost of these crimes, the ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate violence. Their strength in continuing to seek justice, to keep their loved ones' memories alive, and to advocate for other victims demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable loss. These cases also highlight the crucial role that media attention plays in criminal investigations. The victims who received more coverage were more likely to have their cases solved, while those who remained invisible in life often remained invisible in death. This disparity in attention reflects broader societal inequalities and raises important questions about how we value different lives and different stories. The legacy of these killers extends beyond their individual crimes to influence how we understand serial murder, how we protect vulnerable populations, and how we investigate complex criminal cases. They have contributed to advances in criminal profiling, forensic science, and interagency cooperation that continue to help solve cases today. In this way, the victims' deaths have meaning beyond the tragedy, contributing to efforts that may prevent future crimes and save future lives. As we conclude this examination of these lesser-known but devastating serial killers, we're left with sobering reminders about the darkness that can exist within seemingly ordinary people and the vulnerability of those society often overlooks. These cases challenge us to be more vigilant, more compassionate, and more committed to protecting all members of our communities, especially those who lack the resources or visibility to protect themselves. Looking at these cases, we see a disturbing pattern that extends far beyond individual pathology. These killers didn't operate in isolation. They thrived within systems that failed their victims at every level. The marginalized communities they targeted were already invisible to much of society, making their crimes possible and their detection delayed. Samuel Little's decades-long killing spree reveals perhaps the most damning indictment of systemic failure. His victims, predominantly women of color, involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, existed in what criminologists call the less dead category. These are people whose disappearances or deaths generate minimal public concern or media attention. Little understood this cruel reality and exploited it ruthlessly. He knew that a missing black sex worker in 1980s Los Angeles wouldn't trigger the same investigative response as a missing suburban housewife. He was right. For over 40 years, he moved freely across the country, leaving behind a trail of death that went largely unnoticed. The geographic fragmentation of his crimes further highlights how jurisdictional boundaries can become barriers to justice. Different police departments, different states, different record-keeping systems, all created blind spots that Little navigated expertly. It wasn't until the development of sophisticated database systems like VICAP and the dedicated work of investigators like Texas Ranger James Holland that the full scope of his crimes became apparent. Even then, it required Little's own confessions to connect the dots across decades and thousands of miles. Vicky Jackson's case exposes vulnerabilities within institutions we trust most, our healthcare system. The elderly patients she murdered were already in fragile health, making their deaths appear natural. The drug she chose, mavacurium chloride, was specifically selected because it would cause respiratory failure that mimicked natural death in elderly patients. Her position as a nurse provided both access to victims and the medical knowledge to kill without immediate suspicion. The hospital setting itself became a shield as staff and families naturally trusted the medical professionals caring for their loved ones. The delay in recognizing the pattern of deaths at Nocona General Hospital demonstrates how institutional trust can become institutional blindness. When deaths occur in medical settings, there's an inherent assumption that everything possible was done to save the patient. It requires a significant shift in perspective to consider that a caregiver might be causing the very deaths they're supposed to prevent. Jackson's case led to important reforms in how hospitals monitor patient mortality rates and investigate unusual patterns of death. John Norman Collins terrorized college communities at a time when such environments were considered relatively safe havens. His ability to blend into the student population while committing increasingly brutal murders shattered the sense of security that had defined campus life. The victims, young women pursuing their education, represented hope and potential, making their deaths particularly shocking to the community. Collins' case also highlights the challenges of investigating serial crimes across multiple jurisdictions. The Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti areas involved different police departments, creating coordination challenges that likely prolonged his killing spree. The intense media coverage, while keeping the community informed, also created pressure that sometimes hindered the investigation. The fear that gripped the region was palpable. Female students left universities, parents pulled their daughters out of school, and an entire generations of young women lived under the shadow of Collins' violence. The West Mesa bone collector case represents perhaps the most haunting example of societal indifference to the deaths of marginalized women. 11 women and an unborn child were buried in shallow graves, and their disappearances barely registered in the community consciousness. Most were involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, conditions that made them vulnerable to predation and invisible to protection. The fact that these women could disappear over several years without triggering a major investigation speaks to deep-seated biases in how we value different lives. Their families knew they were missing, but without media attention or public pressure, their cases received minimal resources. It was only the accidental discovery of remains by a dog walker that brought their deaths to light. Even then, the investigation faced challenges because the victims' lifestyles were often stigmatized, making witnesses reluctant to come forward. The unknown identity of the West Mesa killer adds another layer of frustration and fear. Somewhere, a person responsible for at least 12 deaths walks free. The lack of closure torments the victims' families and leaves the community vulnerable to future attacks. The case demonstrates how serial killers can operate with impunity when they target society's most vulnerable members. Rory Enrique Conde's crimes along the Tamiami Trail followed a similar pattern of targeting sex workers, but his case reveals additional layers of bias and neglect. His victims were women trying to survive in an inherently dangerous profession, made more dangerous by society's refusal to acknowledge their humanity. The locations where he dumped their bodies along a busy highway spoke to his belief that these women were disposable, and tragically, the initial investigative response seemed to confirm that assessment. Conde's confession that his separation from his wife triggered his killing spree reveals the dangerous intersection of domestic violence and serial murder. His rage toward women manifested in attacks on the most vulnerable women he could find, those whose disappearances would cause the least disruption to his normal life. The fact that he continued his normal routine while committing these murders shows the compartmentalization that allows serial killers to maintain their public personas while engaging in horrific violence. These cases collectively demonstrate how serial killers exploit existing social inequalities and systemic weaknesses. They target victims who are already marginalized, knowing that their crimes will receive less attention and resources. They move between jurisdictions to avoid detection, exploit institutional trust to gain access to victims, and rely on societal biases to avoid scrutiny. The victims in these cases shared common vulnerabilities: poverty, addiction, involvement in sex work, advanced age, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But they were also individuals with their own stories, dreams, and people who loved them. Samuel Little's victims included mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. Vicky Jackson's victims were grandparents and great-grandparents with families who trusted the hospital to care for them. Colin's victims were young women pursuing their education and building their futures. The West Mesa victims were women struggling to survive in difficult circumstances. Conde's victims were women trying to make a living in a dangerous world. The investigative responses to these cases have evolved over time, driven partly by technological advances and partly by changing social attitudes. DNA analysis, improved database systems, better interagency communication, and more sophisticated behavioral analysis have all contributed to better detection and prosecution of serial crimes. Cold case units now regularly review unsolved murders, looking for patterns that might have been missed originally. Media coverage has also evolved, with true crime podcasts, documentaries, and online communities helping to keep cold cases in the public eye. The attention given to these lesser-known cases helps ensure that the victims are not forgotten and that pressure remains on law enforcement to continue pursuing justice. However, significant challenges remain. The victims of serial killers are still disproportionately drawn from marginalized communities. Sex workers, people experiencing homelessness, individuals struggling with addiction, and people of color continue to be overrepresented among victims. Until we address the underlying social conditions that create these vulnerabilities, we will continue to provide serial killers with pools of potential victims. The legacy of these cases extends beyond the immediate victims and their families. They represent a collective failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members. They demonstrate the deadly consequences of bias, neglect, and institutional dysfunction. But they also show the importance of persistence in seeking justice, the power of technological advancement in solving cold cases, and the critical need for systemic reform. Understanding these cases and the systems that enabled them is essential for preventing future tragedies. We must recognize that serial killers don't operate in a vacuum. They exploit existing weaknesses in our social fabric. By addressing these weaknesses, improving support for vulnerable populations, enhancing interagency cooperation, combating bias in investigations, and maintaining attention on cold cases, we can make it harder for future predators to operate undetected. The names Samuel Little, Vicky Jackson, John Norman Collins, the West Mesa Bone Collector, and Rory Enrique Conde may not be as well known as other serial killers, but their crimes were no less devastating. Their victims deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in criminal justice textbooks, but as real people whose lives were cut short by evil. Their stories serve as a stark reminder of the work that remains to be done in protecting society's most vulnerable members and ensuring that justice is truly blind to social status, race, or circumstances. These cases compel us to confront uncomfortable truths about our society and challenge us to do better. The victims cannot be brought back, but their deaths can serve as catalysts for positive change. By learning from these tragedies, we honor their memory and work toward a future where such systematic failures are no longer possible.